NEWSABC News, I'm Nick Hose. The Prime Minister says he regrets upsetting the former boss of Australia Post, but has stopped short of apologising. Christine Holgate says Scott Morrison's demand she stand aside over the Cartier watches saga was intimidating and humiliating. Mr Morrison has conceded his language on the floor of Parliament was very strong, but won't be offering a personal apology. Political reporter Noah Hayder has the story.
After keeping a low profile for months, Christine Holgate is fighting back.
I think it's one of the worst acts of bullying I've ever witnessed.
And demanding an apology from the Prime Minister.
It was not my intention to cause distress to Christine Holgate, and I regret any distress that strong language may have caused to her, indeed did cause to her.
But sorries are hard to come by in politics.
I don't think there's a need for that.
The former CEO departed her post last year after being blasted for gifting 4 senior employees Cartier watches for securing a major banking deal back in 2018.
She's been instructed to stand aside, and if she doesn't wish to do that, Mr Speaker, she can go.
And she did. But it was this episode that Miss Holgate claims left her suicidal and effectively ended her career at the organisation.
I think you would have rather hoped that before somebody publicly hung you and humiliated you, that they may pick up the phone and call you.
She believes the disproportionate backlash was partly due to the fact she's a woman.
This issue wasn't about gender. This was about taxpayer organisations handing out Cartier watches to well-paid executives.
At the time, the revelation prompted condemnation from both sides of politics.
Christine Holgate has done the wrong thing. I support her paying a price for that.
The opposition leader today rejecting suggestions he helped fuel the furor.
I made those comments because Scott Morrison made her position one in which she couldn't possibly continue.
Scott Morrison's intervention on the floor of Parliament 6 months ago was the catalyst for this sorry saga. Christine Holgate remains locked in a contractual dispute with her former employer, and she wants the Prime Minister's help to resolve it. He now argues it's not his place to interfere. Noah Hayder, ABC News, Canberra.
Scott Morrison says he's putting National Cabinet back on a war footing so that state leaders can help deal with Australia's troubled vaccination rollout. While the federal opposition is accusing the Prime Minister of attempting to shift blame, Mr Morrison has indicated millions of Australians should now expect to get their jabs in mass vaccination centres rather than at pharmacies or the GP. Political editor Andrew Probyn reports.
Having put the nation on a war footing, Scott Morrison headed to his own Western Front. Prime Minister. A Liberal wasteland after Labor's barnstorming state election victory last month.
They have rewarded the strong leadership of Premier McGowan.
The Prime Minister wanting to conscript the WA Premier and other state and territory leaders to a twice-a-week national cabinet to speed up the vaccine rollout.
You've got to be practical, you've got to work together. You've got to solve problems.
Under Scott Morrison, we'll meet them on the beaches, we'll meet them on the phone hookups. That's his idea of war footing.
The Premier's a bit more charitable.
And I'm relieved that there seems to be a sense of urgency, but I do also urge the federal government to continue to share information with us.
I would have anticipated we would have needed to meet more often as we got in more supply, but happy to go along with whatever the Prime Minister requests.
The locally made AstraZeneca vaccines no longer recommended for those under 50, and the overseas supply of the Pfizer alternative is tight. But the Prime Minister now favours establishing a mass vaccination program to catch up.
Firstly, in the instance of those aged between 50 and 70.
Melbourne's Royal Exhibition building's already been put to use, as it was during the last pandemic a century ago. And other cities around Australia have also set up central vaccine hubs. But with the vast bulk of Pfizer doses not expected to arrive until later in the year, Australians under 50 will have to wait until closer to Christmas to get their jabs.
But that will only be possible if we can ensure that we have the max vaccination program in place that can do that in that space of that final quarter.
Though Scott Morrison's being careful not to commit to any new targets, when he meets premiers on Monday, they'll receive vaccination scenarios from health officials. One will involve ramping up AstraZeneca jabs for the over 50s from June, then distributing the bulk of the Pfizer doses for the under 50s from October. Only the states can organise mass vaccination, so if things go wrong, blame would be widely shared. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Aged care homes are among the highest priorities for coronavirus vaccinations, but many are in the dark about when vaccination teams will arrive. Most aged care residents are yet to get a visit, and staff have been largely left out of the rollout.
Some of our most vulnerable citizens to COVID-19 and not a vaccine in sight.
It is a little concerning. Certainly all of our residents would be Category 1A, vulnerable, increasingly acute.
Al Windor in Adelaide South still hasn't been told when the Commonwealth vaccination team will arrive. They hope to find out this week.
The rollout has been slower than we'd anticipated. A number of care homes in the surrounding area have had theirs.
On the latest figures published by the federal government, the Commonwealth has administered around 152,000 doses in the aged and disability sector. First doses have been delivered in at least 1,100 aged care homes. That's just over 40% of the homes in the country. Progress is even slower among workers in aged care, people who have unwittingly seeded coronavirus outbreaks in the past.
Our advice to staff has been to contact their GP and get their vaccination independently of work.
Just a little jab in the upper arm.
One private aged care provider in Melbourne chose not to wait.
We really didn't want our resident staff or contractors to endure another winter with the nervousness and trepidation that they have endured.
The federal government agreed to supply Pfizer doses, which TLC Aged Care is administering through its own medical clinic.
We only have 3 weeks left, and all staff, all contractors and all residents will be fully vaccinated.
So just hold on to that one.
Phase 1A won't be finished until all workers are vaccinated too, and the new AstraZeneca advice has left that without a timeline.
Right now, our focus is principally on vaccinating people for whom the AstraZeneca vaccine does not present a challenge.
And while AstraZeneca rolls out, many of the people at the front of the queue keep waiting. Casey Briggs, ABC News.
You may have wondered if COVID restrictions are effective, like wearing masks, social distancing and even closing schools and workplaces. Now there's new modelling showing the impact of the different measures during Victoria's second lockdown last year. Medical reporter Sophie Scott has the story.
Masks and face coverings will, from 11:59 p.m. Wednesday night, be mandatory.
Victoria was plunged into a strict lockdown in 2020 to stop the steep daily rise in the number of people being infected with COVID-19. A new study has confirmed the critical role of face masks.
If we hadn't have mandated face masks at all, our model suggests that the ICUs would have been full and essentially overwhelmed.
Monash University researchers found face coverings reduced transmission and infection risk by up to 46%. Physical distancing was estimated to reduce the risk by up to 28%.
We've got strong evidence that face masks should be the first thing. It's much more reasonable to ask somebody to use a face covering than to close their business or to shut a restaurant or a shop.
They found closing schools only had a moderate impact on reducing infection rates. But if schools had remained open, measures like masks would have had to be in place for longer.
If you can imagine a situation where you didn't mandate masks, you continued on with life as previous, I think we would have had months of very, very high rates.
With multiple states enforcing snap lockdowns in the past few months, mostly when the virus escaped hotel quarantine, the findings demonstrate the real value of such measures.
I think what this research shows is that those physical distancing measures really work. And so what we need to do is essentially to go hard and go early in terms of physical distancing.
Experts say the results will help inform government response about measures to put in place to keep the virus under control. Sophie Scott, ABC News.
Scores of defence personnel and dozens of support crew from across the country have flown into WA to help clean up in the wake of tropical cyclone Seroja. The ADF came armed with heavy machinery to provide the extra muscle to help with clearing debris. Hundreds of homes and businesses have been damaged and some are still being assessed. Authorities warn the recovery effort could take years.
The clean-up is going to take less time than that, but if you think about someone who has to rebuild a house, it's going to be 2 years.
It's likely many of the damaged homes will have to be demolished. Steve Cable is the manager of the Kalbarri SES. He says while this cyclone was relatively short, it was very intense.
The destruction was quite frightening, really. 70% of all buildings were damaged in some way. 40 to 45% were severely damaged, and about 10% were complete write-offs. So you throw in all the trees, throw in all there's a bit of an asbestosis thing going on. If you talk about all the fences, it's quite a epic event, to say the least. We're fighting the front line position, that is making buildings safe, ensuring that try and stop water integration into roofs and things like that. But at the same time, there's whole resources pouring into town to deal with other issues such as water, power, security, also things like transport, housing. So there's a whole infrastructure that's building outside of the fact that we're actually dealing with the cyclonic events results. There are some people shattered. If you can imagine, you've lost your whole house. People have lost their whole businesses. It's a tourist town, and it's a pretty hard thing to look at and say, look, where do I go from here? Some people feel very, very guilty because their houses were left intact and all their friends had their houses basically destroyed. So psychologically, there's people are really struggling with it, but it's a resilient town. It's been a fantastic effort by the locals to look after each other and as a town to be reborn. So it's been quite pleasing and really quite exciting in some ways as well. I've been around cyclones a long time. I lived up north for a long time. I ran quite a lot of operations up there. But to actually, this one was surreal. It was only 45 minutes, but you could feel not only the roar of the wind, it was just like 3 or 4 freight trains, but you could feel the power of it. You could feel the energy, and it was just undescribable, really. It was very frightening, and of course the suspense after it had gone through, because don't forget it was in the middle of the night. What damage has been done, and when we could, we went out and had a look, and it was devastating. There's 2 major phases here. One is like the operation, that is what we're doing, putting tarps on roofs where we can, making it safe. But then there's the aftermath, because you've got the insurance, you've got people needing counselling, you've got people needing support with some of the medical stuff, you've got people who need to plan. There's just so many other things going on. So that'll be ongoing for quite a long time, months and months and months.
The Australian Defence Force has been reminded its primary mission is the lethal application of violence amid concerns from some government MPs that the military has become too politically correct. The blunt directive has been issued as the Navy faces criticism for a controversial dance performance at a recent ceremony. Here's Defence correspondent Andrew Green.
Members of Sydney dance group 101 Doll Squadron report for duty. At last weekend's formal commissioning of the Navy's newest warship, their energetic performance raising more than just eyebrows inside the military.
This is not a time for hip-hop dancing or twerking.
Former soldier Philip Thompson's among a group of Conservative government MPs pushing for a cultural shake-up of the ADF, citing frustrations at recent decisions such as a 2018 ban on troops wearing so-called death symbols.
The ADF has been used or weaponised for a woke culture, and it just simply shouldn't be happening.
His sentiments backed by another veteran, the now Assistant Defence Minister Andrew Hastie, who's declared the ADF's core business will always be the application of lethal violence in the defence of our values, sovereignty and interests. We should never forget that. In a week where allegations of Australian war crimes in Afghanistan have again surfaced, others in the defence community insist the military hasn't been overrun by social justice warriors.
Cracking down on all the skull and crossbones symbology, for example, is getting rid of a silly modern fashion, not catering to it.
Peter Dutton came to the job of Defence Minister with a hardman reputation on China and cyber warfare. Defence insiders expect he and Andrew Hastie will bring that attitude to the broader portfolio. An ex-policeman and an ex-soldier making sure the military's top brass are in no doubt of what's expected. Articulating a clear new thrust for the ADF. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
A Melbourne man who was high on ice and severely sleep deprived when he ploughed his truck into 4 Victorian police officers has been jailed. Mahinder Singh was sentenced today to 22 years in prison over the crash, which was the single greatest loss of life in the force's history.
Still winded by grief and fresh from staring down a killer, the families of 4 police officers gather at Justice's door, finding little solace in the sentencing of Mahinder Singh.
No amount of punishment can replace the loss of our loved ones and the missing place at our tables that will be felt by us for the rest of our lives.
The incident which sparked their anguish is burned into the minds of many. Shortly after pulling over a Porsche on Melbourne's Eastern Freeway, Lynette Taylor, Kevin King, Glenn Humphreys and Joshua Presney were killed when a truck ploughed into them. The driver was Mahinder Singh. Never before seen footage shows Singh drifting into the emergency lane and a near miss before the tragic crash. The father of 2 was high on ice, severely sleep deprived and actively psychotic, convinced that a witch had cast a spell on him.
The police officers had no hope. Their deaths are entirely unnecessary and should have been avoided. Their deaths were caused by you.
For his crimes, Mahinder Singh was today ordered to spend 22 years behind bars.
These fallen members of ours, our colleagues, our mates, died protecting the community from these very things that ultimately took their lives.
Right now in Victoria, there are police people undertaking the same duties that happened on April the 22nd on the Eastern Freeway, and that's not lost on us as leaders about our responsibility to keep our people safe.
Mahinder Singh is 48 years old. He'll be 66 before he's eligible for parole. But this tragic chapter isn't over. The man who police were pulling over that night, Richard Pusey, will be sentenced at the end of the month. Danny Tran, ABC News, Melbourne.
Police have shifted their search for Victorian campers Russell Hill and Carol Clay to Mount Hotham more than a year after they went missing. Officers searched difficult terrain close to the Great Alpine Road based on multiple sources of new information. It's about 2.5 hours drive northeast of the pair's last known location at a campsite. 2 shovels found during the search will be forensically examined. It's not yet known if they're linked to the case.
It is an incredibly remote area. There are parts of that bush that probably have never actually been walked on by humans. It is that remote.
The search is expected to continue tomorrow. Investigations are continuing into a light plane crash north of Canberra late yesterday afternoon. 2 men died when the Cessna came down near Sutton in the Yass Valley. The operator of the aircraft says it'll leave no stone unturned to establish the cause of the accident.
It's a devastating end to a day at work for 2 young men. Emergency services scrambling in the dark to get to the scene near Sutton, where a Cessna light plane crashed into a paddock in the late afternoon.
On arrival, police located a 31-year-old male who was the pilot from Country, Victoria, deceased. as well as the passenger, an 18-year-old male from Albury.
In the full light of day, investigators were trying to piece together the plane's final moments. The Cessna left Canberra Airport about 1:30 yesterday afternoon. The pair were employed by Oberon Aviation Services and were carrying out aerial inspections of power lines for Essential Energy.
At home, spraying weeds, and this aircraft was flying over, checking the power lines, which it does every year. The plane was working beautifully, and it went up and down and came up this way, and I found out after that it had crashed.
In a statement, Essential Energy says its thoughts remain with the families, friends and colleagues of the two men that died. It says it's providing its full support to the investigation. Oberon Aviation Services says it can't speculate on what might have caused this tragic accident. It says it will leave no stone unturned in finding out. Police have now handed the scene over to the Australian Transport Safety Bureau. Lisa Glenday, ABC News, Sutton.
The retrial of NRL star Jack de Belin, who's accused of sexually assaulting a woman, has started in Sydney. The St George Illawarra forward and his friend Callan Sinclair are accused of raping a 19-year-old woman after a Christmas pub crawl in Wollongong in 2018. The pair have pleaded not guilty to aggravated sexual assault, claiming the sex was consensual. The jury has been told it'll hear recordings of evidence given in the previous trial. A white police officer who shot dead a black man during a traffic stop in a Minneapolis suburb has resigned, and the city's police chief has too. The killing of 20-year-old Dante Wright sparked anger on the streets and clashes with police as protesters defied a curfew. The shooting happened kilometres from where an ex-officer is on trial accused of murdering George Floyd.
Can you blame Dante for being terrified as a black man in the custody of police? Amen. When you just watched here in Minneapolis, George Floyd murdered at the hands of the very same police?
Now, my son, he don't have a dad. His dad didn't get to see him for his second birthday or for any of his birthdays.
Prosecutors are yet to decide whether they'll charge the police officer who apparently thought she was using her taser when she fired the shot. All US troops are expected to leave Afghanistan by September 11 to coincide with the 20th anniversary of the Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks that triggered America's longest war. It means the US will likely miss next month's deadline that the Trump administration had agreed with the Taliban last year. President Joe Biden has been hinting for weeks that an orderly withdrawal of the remaining 2,500 troops would be difficult by the original timeframe. Britain will reportedly follow the US and pull out nearly all of its troops while handing over control of Kabul Training Academy to the Afghan government. Egyptian authorities have seized the ship that blocked the Suez Canal, saying its owners owe more than $1 billion in compensation. The Japanese-owned Ever Given container vessel has been in a lake separating two sections of the waterway since it was dislodged. Egypt says the ship won't be able to leave the country until the financial dispute is resolved. International supply chains were thrown into disarray when the 400-metre vessel clogged one of the world's most vital trading routes last month. The Tokyo Olympic Games are just 100 days away. While preparations are ramping up, there are major concerns about COVID in the city. The Australian Olympic team is still hopeful of getting vaccinated as the country's leading athletes head into national championships in the pool and on the track.
Another milestone passed. And in Australia.
And today marks 100 days to go.
But in that time, so much can change. COVID-19 cases are averaging 3,000 a day in Japan. And with new variants emerging, the situation is constantly changing.
It's very hard to continue preparations when we don't know what the situation will be in the future.
The challenge of putting an Olympic Games on during a pandemic, I can't imagine what that would be like. So our job is to get the team there safely, compete at their best and bring them home safely through all the quarantine process.
The Australian Olympic Committee is directly lobbying the federal government to get athletes and officials vaccinated and is confident it'll succeed, despite the slow rollout in Australia.
The athletes and the officials are going into Tokyo. The world is going to Tokyo. So in terms of looking after the health and well-being of the athletes and also giving them that confidence that they have been vaccinated is going to be very important to their performance.
Whether or not they're vaccinated, athletes like canoe slalomist Jessica Fox will be operating in a bubble.
It's just about accepting that and doing the best we can with what we've got, and I'm really looking forward to getting to Tokyo now. It's feeling more real.
And reality is hitting home for the swimmers too. Tonight they begin their national championships here on the Gold Coast. They won't be racing for Olympic selection, but the times they swim will be important if the June trials are cancelled because of COVID.
I think our biggest challenge, to be honest, is the fact that we live in a pretty much COVID-free environment. We're going to be going into a COVID environment, and for us, that's going to be preparing for that and normalising that space.
Because this will be anything but a normal Olympic Games. David Mark, ABC News.
To finance now, and upbeat consumers are starting to have an impact on the economy. Here's Daniel Ziffer.
So, bad news first. JobKeeper ended, the vaccine rollout is problematic, and there's always the threat of snap lockdowns. But consumers have clearly been listening to the good stuff. Our ongoing economic recovery and long stretches without community transmission of COVID-19. The most followed index of consumer sentiment is at its highest level since 2010. The survey asks 1,200 people questions about their family finances, what they think about economic conditions, and if it's time to buy a major item for their household. It's a big result and signals consumer demand will be one of the key drivers of this year's economic story. The ASX 200, an index of the value of Australia's 200 biggest listed companies, broke through the 7,000-point barrier today. That's where it was in February 2020, before, you know. The broader All Ordinaries, 500 companies, remains near its record as well. US indices also at frothy highs as results from some of the world's biggest companies are released. We'll see what that means for our dollar against the US. Today, not much. As the price of oil lifted, can't really blame that ship anymore. And that's finance.
Australia's temporary Antarctic resupply vessel remains berthed in Fremantle, having changed course last week when a fire broke out on board. None of the 109 people on MPV Everest were injured, but it was a dramatic end to a long mission.
As the ship made its way into Fremantle Port, the damage from last week's fire was clearly evident. The blaze destroyed equipment and forced the vessel to limp home using just one of its 2 engine rooms. It was the second fire on board the ship this year, and multiple investigations are underway into its cause.
Obviously, we'll be looking at all aspects of the operations of the vessel to make sure that anything we can learn to make the operations safer will be taken into account.
The fire added to an already challenging expedition to the Davis and Mawson research stations in East Antarctica. Transport issues caused by COVID-19 meant some spent more than 500 days away from home and have returned to what feels like a different world.
Sailing into Fremantle Harbour and seeing trees for the first time for almost 500 days is pretty exceptional. And putting that mask on the first time when we were about to get off the vessel really brought it home that things have changed.
Being away for that long, that was 2 Christmases, 2 birthdays, 2 New Years, watching the pandemic unfold back home, that was challenging.
The Australian Antarctic Division declared its latest mission a success, saying while it was a season like no other, it had kept its stations operating and COVID-free. Crew on board the ship have been given quarantine exemptions, given they've essentially been quarantined at sea for the last 2 months. They'll now assist with maintenance and restocking of the ship before returning home and being reunited with loved ones after a very long and eventful expedition. Charlotte Hamlin, ABC News.
Time for a check of the weather now. Here's Graham Creed.
There's not a great deal of rain across the continent as we move through Thursday. It's due to a ridge of high pressure that extends from Western Australia out into the Tasman Sea. So underneath that, we have mostly dry and sunny conditions. We do have an exception in the southeast. A cold front moving through Tasmania will also clip South Australia and Victoria, so that's going to see an increase in showers there, although the heaviest of the falls are going to be confined to the west coast of Tasmania, but we will see snow to around 900 metres by the evening. There's also a band of clouds sitting across central parts of Western Australia and into the Northern Territory, South Australia. This will trigger a few patchy light showers, but most of the capitals away from the southeast will be clear.
Here are the top stories on ABC News. The Prime Minister has refused to apologise to Christine Holgate but has expressed regret over any distress he caused. The former boss of Australia Post accused Scott Morrison of humiliating her over a luxury watch controversy. Ms Holgate gave 4 executives Cartier watches worth $20,000 as a reward for a lucrative deal. The bonus was approved by the company's board. The Army has arrived in Western Australia to help in the clean-up after Tropical Cyclone Seroja ripped through the mid-west coast. Homes and businesses in Kalbarri and Northampton were significantly damaged by the storm. About 100 Army personnel joined more than 300 emergency crew members who have spent the past few days assessing the damage. The truck driver who killed 4 police officers in Melbourne has been sentenced to 22 years in jail. Mahinder Singh was high on ice and severely deprived of sleep when he ploughed his truck into the officers last year. It's the single greatest loss of life in the force's history. And with just 100 days to go until the Tokyo Olympic Games begin, anticipation on the ground is lukewarm. More than 70% of locals don't want the Games to proceed. Japan continues to face coronavirus outbreaks, but the International Olympic Committee is adamant the Games will go ahead. A fortnight of COVID restrictions in Queensland will end tomorrow morning, after yet another day of no new community transmission. From 6 a.m, locals will no longer have to carry masks, dancing will again be allowed in nightclubs, and families will be reunited when visitors are allowed back into nursing homes and hospitals.
Mary Shang Loftus hasn't seen her husband John for 2 weeks. But every couple of days, she drops off his freshly ironed shirts to his aged care home.
John has been lonely. Only one day that he mentioned to me, I feel very neglected. And I said, well, darling, it won't be long.
She can't wait to sit with him again.
Tomorrow will be wonderful. A big embrace and a big smile.
With another day of no community transmission, the restrictions imposed a fortnight ago can be lifted from 6 a.m. tomorrow.
Queenslanders have done a mighty job and I want to thank everyone. It has not been easy over these last 2 weeks.
We'll be allowed up to 100 people in our homes. There'll be no limit on outdoor gatherings. Theatres and stadiums can go back to full capacity. Queenslanders will no longer have to carry masks with them, except for in airport terminals or on planes. In this Mitchelton Pilates studio, it means the return of mask-free workouts.
They can huff and puff without a face mask on, and we've kind of been a little bit softer on them over the last week, so it's time for some hard work.
After a snap lockdown, a quiet Easter and 2 weeks of restrictions, pubs and clubs are hoping Queenslanders are ready to let their hair down again so that businesses can start to recoup some of their losses. It's been a difficult time for Valley nightclub owners.
I think we've been running at about 10 to 15% of normal trading figures.
But with the rules relaxed and the dancing ban abolished, there'll be movement on this dance floor once more.
We'll have 2 dance floors running. We'll have a mask-off party.
How good will
all
that
weekend.
be?
Oh, it'll be awesome. Yeah, it'll be a lot of revelling.
Getting our boogie back for now. Jessica Van Vonderen, ABC News.
One of the most senior doctors at a major Sydney hospital has issued an extraordinary warning. She says staff shortages at Liverpool Hospital are so dire, the quality of care for patients is at risk. Concerned locals say the hospital is struggling to meet the complex needs of a growing community.
I did before, we just pull the tops off and off the roof.
It was like any other day at home for Tony and Mary Felgate until he complained his body was turning numb.
I was really, really worried. And we spent all weekend really, really worried.
The 80-year-old was rushed to the stroke ward at Liverpool Hospital, but he had to wait 3 days for doctors to confirm his diagnosis.
I thought that was pretty off. If you're going to have the equipment, you've got to do it 7 days a week.
Liverpool Hospital is the biggest in southwest Sydney, but senior clinicians say it doesn't have enough money to hire the number of doctors needed.
We are full. We are full. We are over our 100% bed base all the time.
New South Wales Health says it spends more than $1 billion a year on the hospital. But a recent inquiry has found southwest Sydney is being shortchanged. $1,700 was allocated per person, while in some other health districts it was much higher.
We need more junior doctors and we need more emergency surgery, and we need more after hours and in hours diagnostic radiology.
Local leaders fear the hospital can't cope with a booming population.
It's just going to get worse, and we're going to continue to have second-rate health services. We're not getting our fair share.
The Health Department has promised $740 million to redevelop the hospital over the next 5 years. But doctors say buildings alone won't solve the problem because it takes people to treat patients.
Give us the money now to recruit all the staff now. We'll find a way to use them. We'll open after hours.
Without change, patients like Mr. Felgate aren't sure they can count on the hospital. Tony Ibrahim, ABC News, Sydney.
Fraud charges against 8 former Logan City councillors have been dropped almost 2 years after their arrests triggered the entire council sacking. The group had all been charged by Queensland's Crime and Corruption Commission.
An emotional embrace between 2 former colleagues marks the end of a long-running criminal legal battle for them.
I have lived through 2 years of torture and hell.
In 2019, these women and 6 other Logan City councillors were sensationally charged with fraud relating to the dismissal of council CEO Sharon Kelsey. The CCC alleged they acted together to dishonestly cause detriment to Ms Kelsey by terminating her employment. The councillors were automatically suspended, and in a rare move, the entire council was sacked.
I have been left with no option but to dismiss the council.
But inside a packed Brisbane courtroom, those former councillors clapped and cheered when a magistrate officially withdrew all their fraud charges, prosecutors telling the court there was not enough evidence to continue with the case.
I stand here today vindicated and innocent, as I've always claimed that I was. It's 2 years of my life that I've been living circling a whirlpool, not knowing whether not knowing whether I'm going to go to jail or not.
Careers have been destroyed. I've done 34 years as a local government representative for Logan.
The collapse of the criminal fraud case has sparked calls for an independent inquiry.
It was completely, utterly wrong for the CCC to bring charges in the criminal jurisdiction for what is an employment matter.
In a statement, the CCC says it accepts the DPP's decision, but has defended its action, saying it has at all times acted within the bounds of its powers and jurisdiction, and it's difficult to see how it could be reasonably suggested there should be an inquiry.
There should be a full and public apology, and these 7 people should be properly compensated.
While all fraud charges have now been dropped, this is not the end of the criminal case entirely. Former Mayor Luke Smith has been committed to stand trial on 2 charges of misconduct in public office, one involving an alleged dishonest probation process relating to Ms Kelsey. The state government declined to comment. Kate McKenna, ABC News, Brisbane.
There's been growing calls to improve sex education as the country faces a reckoning on the treatment of women. From today, teachers and parents can access 350 new online materials to help teach children about consent and respectful relationships. Georgia Carr is a sex education researcher from the University of Sydney, and she joins us now. Georgia, welcome.
Hi Nick, thanks for having me.
So when it comes to sex education, when is a good age to start talking to children?
Yeah, so I think sex education is quite a broad umbrella. I think when we think of sex education only as, say, vaginal sex, it feels a bit confronting to think about having those conversations at a young age. But really, consent education, for example, can start as young as you like. When we're thinking about consent in terms of who can touch your body, in terms of how you share your toys, in terms of who can borrow your car, really there's no age that's too young to be talking about that.
And we've seen before that sometimes in the absence of proper information, children are getting information from unreliable sources. How much of a problem is that?
Yeah, so something like the internet can be an incredible resource, and we know that young people have been turning to the internet more and more. And the internet has lots of really great information, but it's also got some not so great information. And young people and adults as well don't always know what's reliable and what's unreliable. And that's why it's really important to have this kind of education in our schools, because we know that young people trust teachers as a reliable source of information.
And how much of a problem is that, getting information from the internet? Like, in your research, have you come across a lot of that?
Yeah, so again, I don't know if you can measure it specifically in terms of I learnt this from the internet and then I did this as a result. But we do know that young people want to be able to get reliable information from a reliable source, and schools are a really great place to do that.
Yeah, so why is it important, I guess, to have a teacher or someone who's just not a parent for young people to talk to? Why does that relationship matter?
Yeah, so it's exactly as you say, it's that they're not a parent. It can be really important to have a responsible, reliable, trustworthy adult in your life that isn't a parent. Now, students can also tell us that teachers can also be awkward in their own ways, so it's actually important to have a network of contacts. It's great for young people to be able to talk to their parents, to be able to talk to their teachers, but they might also have family friends, siblings, or other people in their life that they can talk to as well.
And I know that you're not the absolute oracle, but I mean, when it comes to talking about sex and sex education, why do some parents struggle?
In terms of communicating about sex education with their own kids, or in terms of what they're learning outside of a parent-child conversation?
In terms of talking to their own kids about sex education.
Yeah, so I'm not a parent myself. I'm sure they can tell you what's awkward or not awkward or difficult about that conversation better than I can. But I think parents probably think about sex as something that happens as the talk, something that happens on one occasion that you've got to build up for. But really, I think it can happen as an ongoing conversation. As I said, something like consent can happen outside of a sexual context, and you can talk about it outside of sex. I think it's good to have that as a rolling conversation. But what I would say to parents as well is, very likely your children want to be having these conversations. Consistently, we find when we talk to young people, they want to be learning about this.
And how would you start that conversation with the young person if they ask you a question about consent, for example?
Yeah, I think very often our conversations about consent, at least in schools or in sort of educational settings, we're starting from the law. So we're very often talking about what is the legal definition of consent. And I think that's a good place to start. But it's really important that we unpack that a little bit. It's one thing to say, for example, it's illegal to drink before the age of 18, but we know that saying that on its own does not stop people drinking under the age of 18. So I think starting with something like a legal definition can be valuable, but we really need to talk about what are the values or ideologies that sort of underlie those laws. What values do we need to take into our life? What principles do we take into everyday situations, including sexual encounters?
And we'll just unpack it a little bit. What are some of those values and principles?
So fundamentally, consent is about sort of bodily autonomy. So the idea that your body is your own and you get to decide who gets to touch it and who gets to do what to it and when. And it's about respect. Those are really the two principles underlying consent, including our consent laws. It's about respect and it's about autonomy.
Okay. Georgia Carr, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thanks so much, Nick.
Well, drink spiking is a well-known worry for many women heading out to bars and clubs, but the official number of incidents paints a different picture. Victims believe misinformation and stigma are to blame for the massive underreporting of a significant issue.
This is the moment Prue McClarty-Hall almost collapsed soon after arriving at this Fitzroy bar.
She slumped forward. Right. She could obviously barely walk.
It was the second time Prue says she's had her drink spiked.
I thought I had done everything that you're supposed to do to protect yourself.
She tested positive for benzodiazepine, with the drug most likely to be Rehypnol.
The test was done by a private lab at their own expense. They weren't going to repeat the experience of Prue's first drink spiking when she ended up at Melbourne's St Vincent's Hospital.
They checked her pupils and the nurse said, oh yeah. They then said, we can do the test, but our advice would be you need to think really carefully about having that done. If you test positive for something, that could go on your permanent record. And that can affect future job prospects.
Prue didn't go to police. Few women do.
A lot of victims are worried that they're not going to be believed, or that worse than not being believed, they might actually be blamed for what's happened to them.
Just 16 drink spiking offences have been recorded in Victoria over the past 5 years. But a national study in 2004 estimated thousands of drink spikings took place over a year. It also found a third of spikings resulted in sexual assault. But in the 17 years since, there's been no further national research.
We know that it is very underreported, and that lack of data is a huge problem for us because it means we don't know how often it's happening, we don't know where it's happening.
But it's happening a lot. When sex education campaigner Chanel Contos asked her Instagram followers about it, she was inundated with stories of drink spiking. At a work event at a Sydney law firm, an 18-year-old girl on her first night out in Canberra. Many also told of sexual assaults. In December, up to 8 women were hospitalised after visiting several venues on Chapel Street. Last month, Bendigo police investigated 10 reports of drink spiking at one venue, but no official complaints were made. Both investigations have since closed. One of the main problems is that only official complaints to police count towards the number of offences, not simply reports or information that's passed on. Another is that sexual assaults that are the result of drink spiking are only recorded as sexual assaults, so they don't show up in statistics either. Meanwhile, Victorian emergency departments don't have a specific category for recording drink spiking. And until the problem is recognised, it can't ever be fixed. Leanne Wong, ABC News, Melbourne.
For Muslims in Australia, this year's Ramadan celebrations have taken on an added significance. During the holy month, followers fast for about 12 hours a day. It's also a time for families to come together, something that was challenging during last year's lockdowns.
In Melbourne's west, the Al-Shakshir family is preparing for an important meal. The holy month of Ramadan has begun and they're breaking their fast for the first time since sunrise.
It's a month where we find the time and put a lot more effort into getting together. But it's also important on a personal level.
If God wills, I want to make the most out of this Ramadan by, working on my character as well.
And number one.
This Ramadan, there's added significance. In 2020, COVID-19 lockdowns prevented many families from gathering to hold iftar dinners like this.
By the end of the day of Ramadan, when they are breaking the fast, eating a very nice meal, they remember those who are not. And then they are encouraged to care about the poor people in the world, giving them a charity, a donation and supporting them.
The beating heart of the Islamic community, the mosque, is busy again. There are extra prayers at night during Ramadan. Masks are compulsory if social distancing can't be maintained.
We keep reminding the people that we have to follow the rules until we get rid of COVID.
Islam is one of the fastest growing religions in Australia. There are around 600,000 followers, most of whom live in Sydney and Melbourne.
We believe that Muslims in Australia are practicing the month of Ramadan in a different way than the Muslims in Muslim countries, because we share Ramadan with the non-Muslim brothers and sisters. We let them know what Ramadan is aiming for.
In the Middle East, some watched the moon rising to mark the start of Ramadan. Markets were busy, and at Mecca, only those who had been immunised against COVID-19 were allowed to make the holy pilgrimage. The site normally hosts more than 2 million worshippers. This year, it's just 10,000. Christian Silva, ABC News.
Germany is struggling to curb a third wave of the coronavirus pandemic. There's been more than 21,000 new cases today and 342 deaths. Deutsche Welle correspondent Thomas Sparrow joins us now from Berlin. Thomas, how serious is the current situation?
The situation is certainly very serious if you judge by not only what Chancellor Angela Merkel has stressed, but also Germany's health minister and the leader of Germany's Public Health Institute, the Robert Koch Institute, they have stressed that the situation now with the third wave is very problematic in Germany, with numbers also rising. You had over 20,000 new coronavirus cases in the last 24 hours, and the 7-day rate is above 150, so certainly very serious here in Germany, and that's why there has been a big debate here in the country as to what measures should be followed, what path the country should take in the next few weeks if it is to tackle that third wave of the coronavirus pandemic. It is a big political debate on the one hand, but it's also a big public health debate on the other, with many asking whether the government is doing enough to tackle the pandemic or in what areas the government should tackle it more efficiently.
Yeah, well, how is the federal government planning to take control of pandemic management?
Well, it's important because up to now, the way that Germany had handled the coronavirus pandemic, for example, during the first or the second waves, was by having a meeting in the German Chancellery, so not far away from where we are talking now, between the German Chancellor and the leaders of Germany's 16 regions. Those leaders of Germany's 16 regions are essentially in charge of implementing coronavirus pandemic policies in their respective areas. But what has happened is that many of them have not implemented the measures that have been agreed on, because the situation there in their respective regions is different from the overall national average. So this has basically meant a patchwork of measures here in Germany and a lot of confusion among the German population. In fact, a majority of Germans have said that they have lost track of what measures apply where. So what has happened now is that Chancellor Angela Merkel has decided to take matters into her own hands, to make an amendment to a national infection law which will allow the central government to implement uniform measures across the country, which regions must then implement if coronavirus infections go beyond a certain threshold.
And Thomas, the German election is getting closer. How is that affecting the approach to restrictions?
Well, it is essentially making things more difficult because every party is now trying to profile itself accordingly in view of that German election that is coming up. You may remember that Chancellor Angela Merkel is not standing for re-election, so there will be a new chancellor here in Germany after the elections in September, and this is just making things more difficult. The coronavirus pandemic is certainly the key element of discussion here in the country, and it has affected leadership, public opinion. So Angela Merkel still remains, for example, the most popular politician in the country, but her numbers have fallen, and there is now a big discussion as to who could replace her and when. There's also among her Conservative bloc a big debate as to who could lead the Conservative bloc as main candidate for the September elections, and the same applies to other parties as well. So as you can see, the focus is on the one hand on implementing measures to curb that third wave of the coronavirus pandemic, but on the other hand, we always have to take into consideration that we're talking here about politics, and we're talking here about the German election, which is very important, which will happen in September.
All right, Thomas Sparrow in Berlin, thank you. The